Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about green building reach codes, and we've talked about energy, we've talked about electrification. I'm going to talk about CalGreen and some of the other kind of trends that are happening in green building. So I work at the U.S. Green Building Council. We are a nonprofit that has headquarters in DC, but we also operate all around the world. And we do a lot of things, community engagement. We do accreditation and credentialing for professionals through LEED credentialing. We also have a green schools program and lots of conference and events. But the main thing we're known for is our LEED rating system. And so I just wanted to share some kind of stats of where LEED's at now. We're currently in LEED version 4.1, which is a kind of a beta version of the most recent rating system. And there's lots of updates to the rating system to capture a lot of things you've heard about today: increased energy efficiency, looking at renewables and electrification, and zero energy buildings, as well as things like embodied carbon. But I'm going to talk about CalGreen today. And I guess part of my role is I work at USGBC. I'm also on the Sustainability Commission at Contra Costa County here locally where I live. And I'm also a member of the CalGreen Code Advisory Committee for the state. So kind of worlds colliding here. But when it comes to the building code, just a quick refresh or primer on the CalGreen, which is part 11 of the building code. Oftentimes when we hear about Title 24, we just think of part 6, but there are actually 11 parts to it, and CalGreen is the newest one. And CalGreen importantly has a set of mandatory provisions that have been required since 2011, essentially. And I'd like to summarize them in these kind of 4 categories of measures. There's basic quality construction practices, things like rodent proofing buildings and providing overhangs from water and intrusion. Also green practices that are not addressed in the building code before, things like recycling, construction waste recycling, things like that. There's duplications of other requirements found elsewhere in the code, or they point to other codes like the energy pieces. And then there's additive requirements to state or other code requirements, things like stormwater that extend beyond maybe local regional policies down to the building level. So CalGreen is this kind of comprehensive set of measures that look at the kind of the whole environmental aspect of our construction industry and effects of climate change as a health and safety measure within the building code. Now, the mandatory measures at this point, they've been ratcheted up over time, and they apply to nearly all residential and non-residential permits, including additions and alterations. And so you kind of see on screen here, there's residential. Anytime you add volume or area, you got to trigger the CalGreen measures that are in scope. Non-residential is a little more limited, but they also address additions, alterations. And importantly, these are state mandated, and locals are allowed to exceed CalGreen, and they often do by filing findings based on climatic, topographical, or geological conditions. So that's similar to the energy provisions that we've talked about, the reach codes and things, but you don't have to have the cost effective necessarily for the CalGreen codes. You just have to have these findings. And a lot of times the CalGreen codes are exceeded by reach codes. So to that effect, CalGreen has what's called these kind of tiers. They are prescripted sort of lists of measures that go above and beyond the basic code requirements, and they can be adopted via local amendment. There's the energy reach code piece that was developed by CEC that Will shared earlier. There's also additional green building strategies and increased thresholds for things that go beyond the mandatory measures. So like your EV parking goes up to a higher percentage than the mandatory, for example. And the tiers, importantly, when filing findings to adopt a reach code, the tiers can be modified as desired by a local when adopting. So they can be changed any way that is suitable to local conditions and requirements. And we often see of the tiers, there's not a lot of them that have been adopted, but when they're adopted, it's usually just the energy piece and maybe a few other things, or it's everything but the energy piece. It's just, there's all different flavors of how they've been adopted. The categories for CalGreen are sort of summarized in this pie chart. There's indoor air quality, site, construction best practices, energy, water, and materials. So it covers a broad range of categories that haven't been found in the building code before. And I'm not going to read this list, but here's just kind of a summary of the measures that are in the residential code, things like stormwater and EVs and all the way to Energy Star bathroom fans, things like that. For non-residential, it includes a lot of those same things, almost all of them, I would say, plus some conditions for bike parking, light pollution reduction, shade trees, commissioning, There's a requirement to follow the water efficient landscape ordinance in the state or better, which most places have done better. And there's things like no CFCs and halons and refrigeration, things like that. So there's about 20 to 30 measures included in CalGreen that are mandatory on most projects. That's kind of the takeaway. Now, what comes to the tier measures, they have increased these thresholds. There's electric vehicles, water use, energy, low emitting materials, importantly. As we kind of make our buildings more tight and more efficient and seal them up very carefully, it's important how we ventilate those buildings and what's off-gassing into them. So low emitting materials is a crucial part of what's in the CalGreen and tiers in particular. There's other things you see on this list here that are not found in the mandatory code. So you can review those at a later date. I think the important piece here for CalGreen is also the enforcement. I just highlighted here a checklist from the LA Department of Buildings Services. And I'm sure there's some good examples, but this one I like a lot, their checklist, because they're editable PDFs. So you can go in and you see those kind of shaded cells. There's a way to indicate on your CalGreen checklist where something can be found in the plans, and then make any comments like this is out of scope or only included on this floor for these reasons or whatever that might be. But these really aid in enforcement and is something that we hope has been increased in compliance over the years. So there's a link there to the LA version, but I'm sure there's other good ones locally. But importantly, CalGreen doesn't always require a checklist, depending on the residential versus non-residential. So it's important to have a good, consistent one for enforcement and inspections and things. Now, I want to also share what's coming next. So the CalGreen code, as you heard, it's just on the same schedule as the other building codes for the state. So right now they're finishing up the final kind of public comments and getting all those actions back, and the Building Standards Commission will vote on those sometime next year, with the anticipation that they go into effect at the beginning of January 1st, 2023. So for CalGreen in particular, there's a few significant changes. It's not a major update, but there's a couple things I wanted to highlight. There's a lot of little things like definitions and some terminologies moved around and things. But for indoor air quality, the non-residential buildings will now require low emitting insulation and ceiling and wall panels. Those will be required under the code. Those had been in the tiers before that, but they've been brought down into mandatory for the 2022 code. And then there's some changes to EV charging that's also happening to increase charging capability for multifamily, non-res, warehouse, grocery, et cetera. And they've also removed this requirement to mark additional parking spaces for clean air vehicles. So if you're familiar with that requirement, and then you also have EV spaces on top of that, it's been confusing as to how you stripe and mark those parking spaces. So the state has basically said, it's all about EVs from here on out. That is our clean air vehicle plan. So let's just drop the clean air kind of nomenclature and stick to EVs. Next, where do I go here? Sorry, my screen is freezing. There it is. Low emitting materials. So just quickly, I'll share that what this change is again, it's relocating the section, the tier section, which is the A5, down into mandatory portion of the code. And so insulation products that are inside the thermal envelope need to comply with California Spec Section 1350. This is an emissions criteria that's been around. It was spearheaded in California many years ago and is now part of building codes and rating systems. We use it in LEED. And there's lots of products that meet these requirements here locally. So the time has come to make those part of the code. Same thing with a ceiling, acoustical ceiling tiles and wall panels. So those are all now mandatory. And again, I'll say that that's an important element as we make our buildings more and more tight and efficient. We have to make sure that what's in them is not off-gassing too much and is ventilated properly. And now I'll cover some of the EV changes that are coming for the next code cycle. And just as a refresher, there's level 1, 2, and 3 EV charging. For the most part, what we're talking about for the upcoming changes are level 2 chargers. So those are the 240 volt, typically hardwired, but they can be outlet based, that are kind of residential or commercial use. And so you'll see some requirements that are focusing on level 2 chargers. And another change that they're working on at the state is getting more consistent on the definitions of EV charging. So these are the 3 terms that are typically used or will be used in the new code. There's EV capable, which just means you've kind of run the conduit maybe, and you've got panel space and circuit capacity, but there's no wires or plugs or anything in place currently. EV ready, basically everything's ready to go. You just need the charging infrastructure, like the charger itself or the cable. And then EVSE, electric vehicle supply equipment. That means you've got the charger already installed and a car can just drive up and plug into it. And another thing that's coming in this code cycle is some definition around automatic load management system, ALMS. And there's lots and lots of these, especially when you get into bigger car parking lots where you've got multiple chargers. There was a desire to be able to kind of manage the load across that entire kind of parking area. And there's some conditions that allow that in the new code as well. So I'm not going to read all of these either, but I think that the highlights for what's coming for the residential code is that still a kind of a 10% of all parking spaces for multifamily, hotel, motel have to be level 2 capable, not just level 1. And 25% of those have to have a low level 2 charging receptacles. And then for larger parking spots, the buildings with 20 or more parking spaces, 5% of those have to have the EV infrastructure in place. Another big change is that existing parking lot additions and alterations are going to need to add EV capability as well. So that's a change, a big change for especially things like hotel, motel, multifamily. So there's a renovation of a parking lot, addition, alteration, not just a repair or resurface, but something bigger than that. They have to add some EV charging. And then the tier measures, the voluntary tiers go above and beyond that to 35 or 40% of EV charging. For non-residential, there we go. Very similar things. There's EV capable for 20% of spaces, level 2 again. They do not have requirements for existing additions, alterations currently. And importantly, 5% of your charging for larger parking areas, so 25 or more parking spaces, 5% of all spaces have to have the active EV charging infrastructure in place. So they have to be EVSE. That's a big change from the past. Another one that's interesting to watch is they're putting in a requirement for new warehouses and grocery stores that have loading docks, retail buildings too. They have to have infrastructure to support EV charging for medium and heavy duty vehicles. So we're starting to see those come into codes, which I think mirrors a lot of the state, hopes and mandates for EV light duty and heavy duty trucks in the future. And again, the tiers for non-residential are similar to the residential ones. So lots happening there. Now I'll just kind of shift gears with the last couple of minutes I have here and talk about other green building reach codes that are out there. And this has been touched on today a bit, but this idea of embodied carbon, which is the energy and the materials and the impacts it takes to make our buildings, not just to operate them, all the things that goes into making those products that make up our buildings. And this is a slide from Architecture 2030. There's other pie charts and graphics that are similar. But the takeaway here is that we are beginning to realize, and the science is getting better around, that the energy it takes to operate our buildings is about on par to the energy it takes per year to make our buildings themselves, all the materials it takes as an impact to create the buildings. And so we're starting to see some focus on those embodied carbon emissions, especially for big, heavy materials that take a lot of carbon, like concrete and steel. So you'll see things like the Marin County Code that's focusing on concrete and others. And this is important because as our buildings become more and more efficient, and as our grid, electricity grid, gets cleaner, because all the work you're all doing, the CCAs and everybody, this embodied carbon pie, slice of the pie, becomes even larger. So those great new high performance buildings, the day one emissions, when you open that building, the lion's share of emissions are going to be from the materials, not from the operation of the buildings. So that's a place where there's a lot of intense focus. And there are some reach codes that are looking to reduce embodied carbon. Marin County's got their low carbon concrete code, which has a bunch of resources for how to adopt. And there's some good kind of lessons learned on their implementation so far. So that's one for everyone to check out. Also, whole building LCA, whole building life cycle analysis. How do you use a whole building process to evaluate the materials of your buildings when designing to reduce carbon? And there is a measure in Calgary that has a whole building LCA requirement. And there's also things like the Buy Clean California Act that looks at environmental product declarations of products. Those are kind of LCAs published for a specific product or material. And then there's also, I'll just mention directed use of LEED policies. We're starting to see these around the country, where in the past it would just be earn LEED silver, earn LEED gold, whatever it might be. But now we're seeing similar policies. City of Denver has one of these, for example, where you have to get a LEED silver building, but you also have to get, 8 points in energy, and you have to get the whole building LCA credit, and you've got to get EPDs and construction waste. There's some kind of directed things that address embodied carbon through the rating system as a way to kind of put that emphasis on the outcomes desired locally. And I'll just close with this slide, which is a bit of our kind of USGBC's theory of change, or where we hope to see the markets going with all these things. This is a little bit of a noisy slide, but the idea here is over time, we have building codes that are these kind of traditional codes, and we have these green building codes, which is very much like California. They're hanging that there as a separate chapter of the code. But over time, these two things will come together and become just one base building code that has a lot of these environmental protections and climate change and all these things as part of the building code, not as a standalone or side thing. And there's, of course, things you can do above and on top of a mandatory code. But as that happens, it allows things like LEED and REACH codes and other programs to be able to go farther and reach higher. So our goal at USGBC is to foster kind of a green code marketplace where these strategies just become commonplace, especially the things that can be made mandatory everywhere, and everyone can enjoy the benefits of basic green construction. So that's our kind of theory of change as we go. With that, I'll leave some resources on the next slide. I know you can't take all these down, but you will have the slides. And with that, I will stop the presentation. Thank you.